at Walsh University and beyond, it is our hope this fundamental question will continue to remain at the forefront of your passions and aspirations. While your responses may change, it's important that we never stop writing, sharing, and discussing our own personal credos. Tonight, it is my privilege to welcome Dan Gediman, Executive Director of This I Believe. Dan is the co-editor of 5 collections of This I Believe essays, the New York Times bestselling This I Believe 2, and 2 new collections of essays entitled This I Believe on Love and This I Believe on Fatherhood. As a 25-year public radio veteran, Dan's work has been heard on All Things Considered, Morning Edition, Fresh Air, Marketplace, and This American Life. He has won many public broadcasting's most prestigious awards, including the DuPont Columbia Award. Please give a warm Walsh University welcome to Mr. Dan Gediman.
Thanks so much, Brian, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I'll tell you in advance, I'm coming down with a little bit of a cold, so Brian, hey, you should put some hand sanitizer on. Secondly, my voice may crack a little bit here, so I'll do the best I can. Just to help me get a feel for who all of you are and your level of knowledge of This I Believe, so I can sort of tailor my remarks a little bit. How many of you are first-year students? Okay, very good. Of that group, how many of you have read our book? Okay, it's not the same hand, so the meaning is that. And then my third question to this particular group, how many of you have actually at least started your own essay? No, finished it. Okay, now, for the rest of you, how many of you are upperclassmen? 2. Okay. How many of you are members of the community here in camp? Okay. And are we any faculty or staff? Okay, all right, you're all good. Okay, very good. This will be easy to remember. Because later we're going to do rounds, like Michael wrote the board short stuff, and so we'll do it. This is really great because you're set up pretty much in thirds, so it'll be awesome. We'll do that a little later. We're not actually going to do that a little later, but you never know. You might help move things along. So I'm going to tell you a story. Maybe when you were little, your parents told you a story. I'm going to tell you basically a story about this unbelief. How it came to be, why it came to be, what we have done with it in its current incarnation, and what we are doing moving forward with it. The story starts 60 years ago, actually 62 years ago, 1949. And it revolves largely around a single man who was a great visionary in the world of broadcasting and journalism in this country. His name is Edward Murrow. And for those of you who have astutely read the book, at the end of the book there is an afterword that I've written that talks about the history of this unbelief. And then after that there's an appendix that has the script of the very first episode of This I Believe. And for those of you who are, especially community members, maybe have not read this stuff, and for those of you who didn't get that far in the book, I'm going to play you in a few minutes an excerpt from the first episode, so you can hear what Edward Arnold sounded like. He was a very unique individual in the history of really the country, even the world. He was assigned to cover Europe in the 1930s for CBS Radio. And CBS Radio was trying to distinguish itself from its competitors, which at the time had all the big name stars of radio. And for those of you who don't know this, before there was television, there was radio. It was the only game in town. And everything you can imagine that you see on television was done on radio. So there were sitcoms, there were variety shows, there were comedy shows, there were dramas, and everything in between. But not a lot of news. Not a lot of news. And CBS decided they were going to distinguish themselves by being the news network. So they hired this guy, Murrow, to be sort of their correspondent in Europe. And this guy had no background whatsoever in journalism. He'd never been to journalism school. He didn't have any background in writing or anything. But he was just a smart guy, a creative man, and a guy who just knew how to think on his feet. And he was sort of dropped into Europe at a time when there was great tumult there. The rise of fascism, the rise of the Nazis in Germany, the fascists in Italy and in Spain. And he could hear sort of the drum beats heading toward war. And he eventually became sort of the first great war correspondent in World War II, or what became World War II. And he organized a crew of reporters who covered the war throughout Europe. And in so doing, he became this immensely famous and important man. He's largely given at least partial responsibility for bringing America into World War II and sort of preparing things so that when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Americans were sort of ready already to go to war. They'd been hearing all these broadcasts for a couple of years in Europe about all the atrocities that were going on there. So that's a little bit about who Edward R. Murrow was. And when World War II ended, which he had covered, America was in an interesting place in its history. We had just gone through as a nation over a decade of the Great Depression, okay, which some of you have at least read about, maybe heard about from grandparents or older relatives. It was a time of great deprivation, massive unemployment. It was not unheard of for people to have been out of work for most of a decade and living on, handouts. This was everything we know about sort of the safety net of this country grew out of that time. Social Security didn't exist prior to that. You were just sort of, left to your own devices. So it was an interesting period in time, and it's a period when people did without most of everything. Okay, you didn't get new clothes every year. You didn't, you were lucky if you were eating. And then World War II happened. They started rationing food and rationing gasoline and rationing all sorts of things, and all sorts of industries that had been, for instance, in this area, in this part of northern Ohio, which had all been about building cars a lot of it, or making tires to put on the cars. It was all tanks and tires to put on tanks, or jeeps or what have you. So when the war ended, for the first time in like 15 years of American history, there was a little bit of money to go around. There were GIs coming back from Europe and Asia, and they had fairly good benefits from the Veterans Administration. They were allowed to go to school, a full ride to college on the GI Bill, it was called. And all of a sudden they were getting good jobs, better jobs. These factories were humming. People were getting really good paying union jobs, or maybe they were moving up the ladder and becoming management, getting white-collar jobs. Enough money that they could buy cars, they could buy houses out in the suburbs, they could have vacation places, they could have boats, they could have stuff after years of no stuff. And so this fellow, Edward R. Murrow, was sort of concerned, at least partly, about the rampant materialism in this country and how people were moving away from the things that had given them solace during the war and during the Depression. Tight neighborhoods, tight religious congregations, tight families, a lot of people who were involved with, going to the place of worship, being in various fraternal organizations and civic organizations. And all of a sudden the war ended, people move out to the suburbs. They're not going to church, they're not volunteering and stuff, they're not getting involved with societal, the stuff that keeps a society glued together. So that concerned him. The other thing that was a great concern to him and his colleagues at the time was an all-pervading fear that was felt in this country.
And to understand this fear, I need to give you just a very brief little history lesson if you haven't, for some reason, studied this period in American history, the late 1940s, early 1950s. As soon as World War II ended, we launched almost immediately into what came to be called the Cold War. And it was predominantly between the United States and the Soviet Union and its allies. And it was all about basically us being terrified of them and them being terrified of us. And we had been allies in World War II just months before, but all of a sudden we weren't friends anymore. And our great fear, we had two great fears. One fear was that they had atomic weapons for the first time. First of all, the first time atomic weapons had existed was just 4 years before, when we exploded the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But now the Russians had the bombs too. And we were afraid they were going to bomb us. You know, we were just, the country would be vaporized. And there were very serious conversations about this stuff. If you had gone to school back then, you would have done something, a grade school, high school, junior high, that seems preposterous now, but people took it very seriously then. And that is, you know how you have fire drills? Well, they would have bomb drills. And during these drills, you'd have to crawl underneath your desk and put your hands over your head, as if that was really going to do anything in the event of an atomic weapon being detonated over your school. If you were living probably right here in Canton, I bet there's a whole bunch of people, if you know where to look, still have bomb shelters. Houses of a certain age, people would build these shelters out of concrete, put them in their backyard or a corner of their cellar downstairs, and you'd stock it with food. And you know, the concrete was supposed to be a certain width, and somehow you were going to withstand an atomic bomb blast, which was also preposterous, really. But nonetheless, people were really concerned about such things. The other thing they were concerned about, and they were hugely concerned about, was that the Russians were somehow going to infiltrate our country with spies. And they were going to take over our country from within. Okay? And all of a sudden, people started looking very carefully at their neighbors, their teachers, their pastors, union officials, anybody who seemed to be slightly weird or was saying anything just a little bit different than, you know, sort of party line, or maybe they were talking about, you know, disturbing things like, again, unions, I don't know, socialized medicine, you know, I don't know if this is ringing any bells to you. But anything to do with anything that wasn't a small, narrow handful of okay concepts and policies. And people were losing their jobs, losing their livelihoods, losing their careers because of this. A lot of college professors lost their jobs because they wouldn't sign loyalty oaths. Kids started to do the pledge, the flag salute, the Pledge of Allegiance during this period in schools as a mandatory thing every morning to reinforce this idea that we pledge allegiance to the flag, not to godless communism. It's one of the reasons they added the word God to the pledge, which didn't exist previously. So anyway, this is just some background on what was going on in America at the time. And this was very disconcerting to Edward R. Murrow and his colleagues. They felt like, because the country was in such a state of fear, it was making terrible decisions. It was curtailing civil liberties. It was spending a whole lot of money on defense. It was doing a bunch of things that he felt were really the wrong direction for the country to get. And so he had this bright idea, he and his colleagues. What if, as an antidote to all this stuff, we devoted 5 minutes on the radio every day, and we asked prominent people who have something to say to talk from their guts, from their heart, about that which is most important to them in their lives, the rules they live by, as he says. And that his hope was this would somehow return America to its roots of a sensible, outwardly motivated, service-oriented country that hung together, okay, and did not, you know, drift apart. And so in the fall of 1951, almost exactly 60 years ago, this radio series went on the air. And I'm going to let you hear a little shard of that very first episode. You'll also have the opportunity to hear Edward R. Murrow, who will sound a little dated to your ears today. Won't sound quite like an Anderson Cooper or certainly not a Jon Stewart. But nonetheless, this was sort of the voice of great gravity in 1915.
Believe. By that name, we bring you a new series of radio broadcasts presenting the personal philosophies of thoughtful men and women in all walks of life. In this brief time each night, a banker or a butcher, a painter or a social worker, people of all kinds who need to have nothing more in common than integrity or real honesty, will talk out loud about the rules they live by, the things they have found to be the basic values in their lives. We hardly need to be reminded that we are living in an age of confusion. A lot of us have traded in our beliefs for bitterness and cynicism, or for a heavy package of despair, or even a quivering portion of hysteria. Around us all, now high like a distant thunderhead, now close upon us with the wet, choking intimacy of a London fog, there is an enveloping cloud of fear. There is a physical fear, the kind that drives some of us to flee our homes and burrow into the ground in the bottom of a Montana valley, like prairie dogs, to try to escape, if only for a little while, the sound and the fury of the A-bombs or the hell bombs or whatever may be coming. There is a mental fear, which provokes others of us to see the images of witches in a neighbor's yard and stampedes us to burn down his house. It has become more difficult than ever to distinguish black from white, good from evil, right from wrong. What truths can a human being afford to furnish the cluttered, nervous room of his mind with, when he has no real idea how long a lease he has on the future? It is to try to meet the challenge of such questions that we have prepared these broadcasts.
And so for the next almost 5 years, every day of the week, 7 days a week, these little broadcasts were aired. 20 of those scripts from those broadcasts are in the books that we want to read. We sort of handpicked, we had a set of 850 episodes of the series that we have recordings of. We had them all transcribed. And we tried to pick out 20 of them that sort of collectively helped to tell the tale of what America and indeed the world was like at that point in time. And there were essays from extremely notable people. A couple of ex-presidents, Supreme Court justice, many major political figures, governors, senators, congressmen, cabinet members, but also artists and scientists, many Nobel Prize winners, Pulitzer Prize winners, best-selling authors, movie stars. It was really a who's who of America at that time. Okay? But something they also did is they got tons of letters from people, almost the very first week this series aired, who were who loved it and really were inspired by it. But also at least one person who took them to task and said, essentially, you know, it's all well and good to hear from these famous people, but what about people like me? What about the everyday people in this country? Don't we have something to say? And so, to their credit, they agreed with her. And they let that particular woman write an essay. And then they started to look around for people that they knew that were not prominent, powerful people, but everyday people. And before too long, there were essays from longshoremen and taxi drivers and teachers and nurses and stay-at-home housewives and truck drivers and at least a couple of convicts in prison. And they tried to make it as much of a cross-section of America as possible. Among the folks that wrote essays for this series were some folks from this part of Ohio. And in particular, one of the most interesting essays that I found when I first started looking into this came from a teenage girl from Cleveland, just a few miles up the road. Her name is Elizabeth Deutsch, and she's in the book that you all have read. And the Cleveland Plain Dealer, as many other newspapers around the country did, once this series took off, it was also turned into a syndicated newspaper series as well. Lots of newspapers started to have competitions for people to write this, I believe, essays. And I should add, many high schools and even colleges around the country like Walsh, although not Walsh, as Walsh University at the time, took this as a curricular item and started to use it in the classroom, started to ask their students to write this under these essays. So this girl, Elizabeth, was one of the first people, one of these students who wrote this and turned it in as an assignment. It was picked as the best youth essay in the Cleveland area and put on the radio, which is pretty heady stuff for a 16-year-old girl at the time. And this is what Elizabeth had to say.
I have a simple faith in the deity, and I hope that my attempts to live a decent life are pleasing to you. If I were to discover that there is no afterlife, my motive for moral living would not be destroyed. I have enough of the philosopher in me to love righteousness for its own sake. This is my youthful philosophy, a simple, liberal, and optimistic feeling, though I fear I may lose some of it as I become more dull. Already, the thought that the traditional thinkers might be right after all, and I wrong, has made me waver. Still, these are my beliefs at 16. If I'm mistaken, I am too young to realize my error. Sometimes, in a moment of mental despair, I think of the words, God loves an honest doubt, and am comforted.
So, I don't know whether that speaks to you at all this many years later, but this was pretty gutsy stuff for a 16-year-old girl. Because what she basically did was she went on national radio, and this was heard weekly by about 39 million people, okay, and said, I don't know what to do spiritually. I tried, elsewhere in her essay she says she went to every single church that she could find, or synagogue, or mosque, in the Cleveland area. Every week she'd go a different place, trying to figure out where she fit in, because she wasn't raised in any particular fit. And there was a firestorm of letters and telegrams that were sent to CBS Radio for her. And she's kept them. She's still alive. She's a college professor at Cornell College, upstate New York, botany professor. And she saved all of these letters that she received, this big, thick stack. And I've read them, and she made photocopies of them for me. And they all are variations on the following. Dear Elizabeth, heard your essay on the Sun Believes. Understand that you're confused about religion. Well, you should come to my church, because we have a wonderful service on Sundays, and our faith is the best faith, and here's why. And by the way, I'm including a copy of Religious Tract in with the package here, and why don't you write back with any questions? And then the next one is from somebody else, and they're all of different faiths. Okay, a rabbi writes her saying, "Honey, you need to go to the temple." Okay, a Pentecostal writes her and says, come to us. We handle snakes. You'll have a great time. And here's the address. So it's amazing that this one girl, her little 5-minute episode, got so many people around the country so excited and worried about her and her soul. Okay, that's the level of zeal people had for this thing. It was turned into sermons that people gave from all different faiths. There was a very famous sermon given by the Cardinal of Los Angeles, that oversaw Southern California. And he was appalled because the former First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, she did an essay. And in her essay, she says basically, I don't know if there's an afterlife. It'd be okay if there was one, but if there isn't an afterlife, I think we still need to behave as though there is one, and treat each other well, and do the right things, and love each other, whether or not there's anything that happens later. Well, Cardinal, whatever his name was, got very upset about this, felt that she had committed heresy, and that this was a travesty that she'd been allowed to do on national radio. On the other side, there were other people who were upset because there was too much talk of spiritual values in this series. And by the way, people talk about everything. They talk about political beliefs and spiritual beliefs and ethical beliefs, philosophical beliefs. In the same way that in our current series, and probably even within the students in this room who have written essays, there's an enormous diversity of beliefs. a little bit, I will tell you that one of the first things, well, let me tell you how I got involved doing this, and then I'll segue back into, we'll come back to Elizabeth Deutsch. She's now known as Elizabeth Earle. I never heard of this I believe. It ended in 1955 in a very dramatic way. It had been cruising along, amazingly popular in this country, and all over the world. It was translated into 6 languages, broadcast all over the world, translated, had their books, they turned these essays into a series of books, one of which outsold everything but the Bible in 1952. They syndicated in newspapers all over the world, very, very popular. And in 1955, there was a man who had been the executive producer of this series and had funded it out of his pocket. He was a very wealthy man. I don't know how many of you ever watched the series Mad Men on TV? No one. Okay. So much for that pop culture reference. Well, this guy was in the advertising industry. He made a lot of money. And he felt bad about it because he had spent his career selling toothpaste and stuff like that. And he decided he wanted to give back something to humanity. So he decided to spend, I think it was probably hundreds of thousands of dollars at the time on this, I believe. And so he bankrolled it out of his pocket. There were no advertisements. Well, in 1955, he got married and went on his honeymoon cruise with his new wife in his new yacht. I think he was a fairly well-off man. And unfortunately, picked a course in the Bermuda Triangle during a hurricane. And his ship was lost at sea, and he was never heard from again. And he never found a stick of wood or life preserver or anything. And with that dramatic ending, this, I believe, came to an end in 1955. And by the time I was growing up in the late 1960s and 1970s, I had never heard of any of this. I ended up going to school and studying broadcasting and journalism, and trust me when I tell you this fellow was a big deal in the world of broadcast journalism. There's no one bigger. And I had read biographies of his, but I had never heard any mention of this, I believe. Until 2003. I was homesick with the flu, and my wife, who loved to, she was an English major, she loved to buy used books at bookstores. And I was looking for something to read, and I found on our bookshelf this, I believe, Edward Murray. And I pulled it off the bookshelf, and I started reading these essays from these folks who, in many cases, were long dead from the 1950s. And they spoke to me. I was really surprised at how much these people from 50 years before seemed more alike than different from me and my peers. The other thing I was struck by is their bravery in talking about difficult things. And back then, to have spoken up about the political situation in this country in the early 50s was a very brave thing indeed to do. And there were quite a few people who stepped up and said, you know what, I don't think what's going on in this country is right at all. I think we should be more worried about how we're treating our own people in this country and worry less about what the Russians are doing over there. And the other thing I was struck by is the parallels between America in the early 1950s and America in the early 2000s. Let's think about what was going on in America in the early 2000s. 9/11 had just happened. I'm assuming you all would have been in maybe late grade school, early middle school when 9/11 happened. Grade school. And I don't know how much you remember, how vividly you remember that time, but it was a very immensely scary time in this country. I mean, like nothing else in my generation or anybody certainly younger than me had ever experienced. And people reacted in a very fearful way, with good reason. We were worried that this wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning of something. And that there were going to be many more attacks. And they might happen any day of the week, and they could happen anywhere. So we needed to be eternally vigilant. And of course, we've never really completely stopped that. You know, I go in airports all the time, traveling to schools like this, and constantly taking my shoes off, my belt off, and doing all this stuff. But in the early 2000s, it wasn't just taking your belt off and your shoes off at the airport. Okay? They were actively, the authorities were doing all sorts of things to try to ferret out the terrorists and the myths, if there were any. And to this day, we don't even know some of the stuff that happened then, or is happening now for that matter. Even though we like to think things have gotten a little bit more relaxed. Relaxed in the sense of following the Constitution rather than kind of doing extra legal stuff. But we digress. 2003, I read this book. I was really moved by it. And I thought in my sort of modest way that maybe I could do something to bring it back to life. And so my first thought was simply to get this book I read back into print, because it was long out of print. You could only buy it on bookshop. And in the process, I was talking to a friend about this, and he said, don't you work in public radio? How about, doing this in your backyard, what you want to do? So I sat down and I wrote out a proposal how we could do this in today's world, utilizing the internet, utilizing public radio instead of commercial radio. And my major idea was, instead of just hearing from people who were actively invited, solicited personally to write an essay, let's ask everybody within the sound of our voice to write an essay, which would most definitely include young people. But I wanted to hear from everybody. So we went on the air in April of 2005, and our very first episode, which I'm going to play for you in a moment, was a sensation. In the same way that the very first episode of this, I believe, back in the 50s was a sensation. I'll let you hear a bit of it, and then I'll tell you about the response to it. This is from a woman named Isabel Allende. And Isabel Allende is a Chilean-American novelist who's written many beautiful novels. And she has also written at least one memoir. And when we approached her about writing this, I believe, essay, she focused very specifically on her relationship with her daughter. And I'll let you hear what she has to say.
I have lived with passion and in a hurry, trying to accomplish too many things. I never had time to think about my beliefs until my 28-year-old daughter, Paula, fell ill. She was in a coma for a year, and I took care of her at home until she died in my arms in December of 1992. The pain of losing my child was a cleansing experience. I had to throw overboard all excess baggage and keep only what is essential. Because of Paula, I don't cling to anything anymore. Now I like to give much more than to receive. I'm happier when I love than when I am loved. Give, give, give. What is the point of having experience, knowledge, or talent if I don't give it away? Of having stories if I don't tell them to others? Of having wealth if I don't share it? I don't intend to be cremated with any of it. It is in giving that I connect with others, with the world, and with the divine. It is in giving that I feel the spirit of my daughter inside me like a soft presence.
When that aired, which was first week of April in 2005, by the end of the day, we had been deluged with letters, with emails, letters out of fashion, from NPR listeners. This aired on National Public Radio. And there was such an outpouring of interest from listeners who really felt moved by the essay. And at the end of the essay, we asked everybody to write their own essays. And that very week, we started to receive essays. In addition, by the end of that day, we were approached by 13 different publishers interested in publishing a book of these essays, even though we'd only aired one of them. But they sort of saw in the crystal ball that maybe this would work. And so it was very flattering. We're radio broadcasters, my colleagues and I. We had no idea. I never really even thought about this being a book. But this book that you all have been reading, I'm pointing here, even though this is not actually a book. It was published in the fall of 2006, and since that time it has sold over 400,000 copies. It was on the New York Times bestseller list, and in general has completely and utterly exceeded our expectations. We thought maybe if we were lucky, it would sell a few copies. We'd get to do one book, we'd get to do 1 year of episodes on public radio, and then we'd move on and do other things. But that's not how it's turned out. We have at this point published 7 books. Actually, it's 6 books, a 7th book is coming in the spring. Our most recent book is called This I Believe, Life Lessons. It just came out in the past month. And we have another book coming out next spring called This I Believe on Motherhood, essays from mothers and kids writing about their mothers. We did a similar book last spring called This I Believe on Fatherhood. And instead of doing 1 year on the radio, we are now in our 6th year on the radio. And we are on every week with new essays from listeners. Since we went on the air in 2005, we've received over 110,000 essays. Very early on, we were approached by a high school English teacher in our hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. And she said, you know, I think this might work as a curriculum to be used in high schools. Do you mind if I take a crack at putting this together? We said, sure, no problem. She came back with a curriculum. We asked if it was okay to put it on our website for other people if they were interested. She said, no problem. Well, that started a ball rolling that we weren't even cognizant of. We weren't even thinking about it vaguely. And that is today, over 175,000 educators all over the world have downloaded either that curriculum, our middle school curriculum, our college curriculum, our English as a second language curriculum, or our adult education curriculum. Increasingly, these are being downloaded by educators in other countries. Over 98 countries before we last counted, including and especially China. For reasons that are a little obscure to me, we are progressively of greater interest to the Chinese. What you're doing right here now at Walsh, with your first year institute, they're doing in Shanghai, in Beijing, in several of the provinces of China. First-year students in the Chinese colleges and universities. Same thing being done in schools in Kenya, in Nepal, in Brazil. We've been talking to, one of the most exciting things that we've been doing just in the last year, we were approached by the U.S. State Department. And they saw value in what we were doing as kind of a grassroots diplomacy tool. Get people in other countries to write this I Believe essays, and then share Americans' essays with them. And maybe this would help us get to know them better, and then get to know us better. So we're working right now on a project in Egypt, where we're working with a series of schools over there, middle schools, high schools, and a couple of colleges, to get their students to write this I Believe essays. I'm going to go over there next summer and train their teachers on how to teach this I Believe in class. So immensely exciting for us. The book that you all have been reading so far has been translated into Spanish, into Korean, into Arabic, into Nepali, and into both kinds of Chinese, the kind of use in Taiwan and the kind of use in mainland China. And I just heard from folks in Korea. They want to publish all of our books in Korea. So for some reason, Korea seems to be in this place. So I say this not to brag about what we're doing, because we're not the ones, it's not our thing. All we're doing is sort of facilitating this transaction between listeners to our radio series, readers of these books, who then create the content themselves, just like you have here at Walsh. Because all we do is, what we do every week, every day of the week, is we read through the essays that you all have written. And we put them in piles based on what they're written about. So, essays about love over here, essays about parenthood over here. And then we ask the people who are reading these to put aside ones that have a particular spark, or particularly well-written, or thought-provoking. And those are ones that we turn to when the time comes to figure out which ones to put on the radio, or which ones to feature in a future book. So I encourage all of you who have written your own This I Believe essay to please go to our website at thisibelieve.org and submit your essay to our project. We will publish all the essays that we receive so that they're available on our website in our archive. And then we like I say, we sort of cherry pick amongst them to put in our books and on the radio. We also feature every week a different set of essays around a particular topic. teacher every week is a different school or organization or community that has done something with this, I believe, either in the classroom or in some other sort of way. And so in addition to just this fall, there are 25 other schools that we know of that are using this, I believe, in the first year experience program. So you are in one of probably hundreds of thousands of students, at least that. I'm thinking aloud. Kent State, right up the road, is using it. Florida State, they have like 10 or 12,000 incoming students. Tufts University in Boston. And I've traveled, this is the 10th place I've been this year. Schools that are using this, I believe. There are also communities where the entire community is reading this, I believe. You're not too terribly far away from Pittsburgh here. The city of Pittsburgh next year is their 10th anniversary. Every year they pick a book and they have a one book, one community read where they, all the schools and the libraries and the newspaper and the public radio station, TV station, all do stuff around a particular book. Well, next year it's going to be a book. And for their 10th anniversary. So we're really excited to work with the city of Pittsburgh. Those are sort of some high points of what the story of where we came from, what we're doing now, and what we're poised to do in the coming years. I wanted to give you all some time, in case any of you have any questions or comments about this. I believe maybe any insights that you yourself have had after having written your own essay, or having read the book. I shared with a group earlier today that I spoke to that every good idea that has been generated about this, I believe, all has come from someone other than my staff members. A school came up with a great idea, a community came up with a great idea, a person came up with a great idea, and then wrote to us about it, or just otherwise let us know about it. So, for instance, I mentioned this earlier, but Ohio State, down the road in Columbus, they, as you know, it's a pretty big campus, and they have a lot of community campus groups. One of their campus groups decided, one of them read our decided the book the same way we did, and decided this would make a good activity for the students on campus to write their own essays. So they came up with this idea, and they thought, well, how are we going to publicize this on campus and get people excited? And Glee had just started. This was last year and a half ago. And so they gathered together, I don't know, thousands of students and organized them and choreographed them into a flash mob doing Don't Stop Believing from Glee's soundtrack. And they did it in their student union, and they shot it with 3 cameras, and they put it up on YouTube. And it's been viewed, if it isn't already 1 million, it's nearly 1 million times. So when you go home tonight, or right now, I suppose some of you have your phones out, you can just put in, you know, Buckeyes are believing. So anyway, open the floor to any questions or comments you might have about this, I believe, or your experience with this, I believe. Yes, sir.
How have you changed since you wrote the book?
How have I changed? Well, first of all, I didn't write it exactly on it, although I wrote a bit of it, I edited it. Well, not just from this book, but from all the various books we've done, and from reading so many essays. You know, at this point, it's probably thousands of essays out there. I have really been moved and really moved by the amazing diversity of beliefs that we have in this country and in this world. I'm moved by, it's very interesting, I'm moved by 2 different things. I'm moved by the great diversity of beliefs in this country, especially, and what that says about this country, that we can have such diverse beliefs and yet not, you know, basically get along fairly well. You know, we haven't had a civil war in what, 100 and, I don't do math, 150 years, give or take a few years. You know, that's pretty good, you know. A lot of other countries in the world can't say that. But the other thing I've been struck by, and it may be more profound, is when I read essays from China. So let's say a college student in China, and I read essays from a college student in Africa, and then I read a college student's essay from Kansas. They're all writing about the same thing. When I read a father in China, and a father in Nepal, and a father in Afghanistan, they're all writing about the same thing. They all want what's best for their kid. They're worried that something bad's going to happen. They want them to have a good job. You know, which is basically the same stuff parents are in reverse, you know. What do I want to do in life? Is it going to be anything? How am I going to pay my school loans? What am I going to be when I grow up? Am I going to be happy? You know, am I going to be alone? Will I ever find a mate? You know, it's all the same stuff. And that tells me that we are so much more alike than dissimilar. So that's what we, I think I have changed. Other questions? Comments? He broke the ice, so, you know, now you can just spring him up. Yes, sir. Wow, front row. He's asking is there one essay that really stood out to me. You know, that's sort of tough. I don't know if any of you are from like at all big families, but it'd be like asking your mom or dad, you know. So honestly, which is your favorite kid? Really? Yeah, and so I will share with you that even in this book, the 80 essays in this book, at various times, some of them have been sort of my favorite. But it's not the same ones, okay? It sort of evolves over time. I will tell you early on, when we first put this book together, I was very taken by this essay called Always Go to the Funeral, by a woman named Deirdre Sullivan. And this is something you might not be able to relate to yet in your life, but I had reached an age where a lot of my friends' parents were dying. And it seemed like I was spending a lot of time in the funeral homes, okay, for the first time in my life. And then I started losing family members, and I started to understand what she's talking about. That there's never a wrong time to go to the funeral home and pay your respects. Okay? I've gone to probably, I don't know, certainly 50 visitations at funeral homes. And never once has anyone said, oh, I'm so sorry. I wish you hadn't come. Really? I feel worse since you've been here. Never once. It's always, thank you so much. It means so much. So that one really spoke to me. There's an essay at the very beginning of the book that often people respond to. It's called Be Kind to Pete's Dude, or actually Be Cool to Pete's Dude. I've often liked that one at various times. There's a wonderful essay. There's an essay that I personally requested a man to write, and he died just a few weeks ago, actually, maybe a month ago. His name is Norman Corwin, and he wrote an essay in the book. And at the time he was 95 years old. He died at 101, just like a month ago. And so that was the first person I asked to write an essay. So that was particularly important. Since we're going in the front row, yes, sir. Okay.
What do you think your life would be like if you never picked up that 1955 version?
It's a really good question. No one's ever asked me it. His question is, what do I think my life would have been like if I never picked up that 50s This I Believe book? It's a really good question. I happen to really like novels and movies that deal in that, like, what if thing. There's a book that just was published this week by Stephen King that imagines what if somebody could go back in history before John F. Kennedy was assassinated and prevent it from happening. So it's kind of that much science fiction. It's a really good question, because at the time that I found that book, I had sort of given up on doing public radio. I was thinking about changing a career. I was thinking about going to graduate school, maybe teaching, God forbid. And so I really don't know. It's a really good question. See, everywhere I go, someone asks a great question that makes me think. Let's put it this way. I would have had a far less rich life. And I'm sure as heck would have gone to a lot fewer colleges and universities in a 6-year period than I have. Other questions? Neither of you have asked a question yet. These guys both asked a question. Oh, you know, we can stop here, but I just want to give you a last question, the last chance. All right. Listen. Oh, yes, over here.
Was it difficult for you to get famous people to write? Get some famous people to
Right.
Did you approach them?
The question is, was it difficult for us to get famous people to write these essays? Short answer, Very, very, very hard. I'll give you an example. There's an essay that we wanted to put in this book, Muhammad Ali. Okay? He agreed to write an essay for us in 2005. He didn't actually write an essay for us until 2009. And in that intervening 4-year period, we either wrote or called his entourage on an almost monthly basis. Did he do it yet? Did he do it yet? Did he do it yet? And every single time they said, he's almost finished, just about done, we'll get it to you in a minute. Wouldn't do it. We tried to get an essay from former President Clinton. We really wanted a former president. We approached every living former president. Gerald Ford died on this. He was considering it. We approached his wife, you know. We approached everybody up to and including the then sitting president, President Bush, and his wife. And President Obama, back when he was state senator Obama from Illinois, agreed to write an essay for us. We had heard about it. Nobody knew who Obama was outside of like the Chicago area. He was a complete nobody. But we knew somebody up in Chicago who was friends with him who said, you know, this guy's a really good writer. He's recently published his memoirs. I think he could write a good essay for it. So we approached him and he said, yeah, sure, I'm willing to do that. And then a couple of months later it was, you know, I'm thinking about running for senator from Illinois. I don't know if I will or not, but maybe, I don't know. So I can't write right now. And then it was, the senator doesn't really have time for this right now. He's being called to the Hill for an important vote. And then it was, senator is considering a run for the White House. And he's going to be a little busy for the next few months. And we're still waiting for this. Bill Clinton's is even worse, actually. He said he would write an essay for us back in 2005. And we did the same thing, like maybe not every month, but every quarter or so we kept checking with these people. And every time it was like the dog ate it. It was just one excuse after another. And my favorite was, we got an email from one of his people saying, Mr. Clinton, well not Mr. President Clinton, just finished giving a speech at Davos, and he's on the Orient Express, traveling across Eurasia. And he's on his way to Prague, okay? And he's writing the essay right now in his cabin, or whatever you call it, his compartment on the Orient Express. And as soon as he gets to Prague, we'll send it to you. I'm still waiting. So it was incredibly hard. The essay from Bill Gates that we had in there. He wrote the essay. We went to record his essay, okay? And he refused to talk to my colleague who always directed people when the way we worked is that people are in a remote studio and we have the directors on the phone through their headphones saying, you know, could you take the first paragraph over again? Or, you know, you missed a word there in the third sentence on the second paragraph. Well, he forbade us from talking to him. He even forbade us from talking to his personal assistant. We had to relay messages to the recording engineer, who in turn relayed it into his personal assistant, who then whispered in his ear. So we had to do it through the hands. So yeah, we had some difficulties getting famous people to write them, record them. And I will say this, we got several essays sent to us unsolicited from very famous people. They tended to be CEOs of major corporations that shall remain nameless. And they were basically press releases. This I believe. I believe that my retail department store chain, the best daughter retail department store chain in America, nay, the world. We have the lowest prices, and then we got one from another company that's Romanian was saying that we offer the best benefit package to our employees. That was what he looked at. So, maybe a final question, and then we'll let you all get to whatever you need to be doing tonight. Oh, by the way, if any of you brought any books, I see a couple of you did. I'm going to hang out outside afterwards, and I'll be happy to chat with you a little bit, write something in your book and personalize it for you. And then you put it on eBay. Give your comment, please. No, I'm kidding. They don't go for that. Final question? All right. Well, Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Walsh.
Push, one more,